Today I'm here with Representative Frank Edelblut, who is a representative up in Hillsborough County, and he's also running for governor. And the reason I wanted to interview you, Representative, is because you have a new bill into place that you're putting into place that actually allows the New Hampshire Guard to protect themselves, whereas today they cannot. Would you please explain to me about the bill and why you're putting that into place?
Sure. So the genesis of the bill was really the tragedy that took place in Chattanooga, Tennessee last summer, which many people are familiar with, where we had a Army recruiting center that was attacked. Servicemen lost their lives, and in that process we discovered that our armed services are really unarmed, which seems kind of like an oxymoron, but that in fact is the case. So when I looked into that in the state of New Hampshire, what I realized is that our New Hampshire Guard facilities were also in a similar situation in that they were designated gun-free zones, and as a result, these guys were at risk because we know if there's a bad guy, there's two things that they look for. They want a high-value target. And you know what? The men and women who serve in the military, immediately when they put on their uniforms, they are a high-value target. You can't do anything about it.
Right.
And so the other thing that bad guys look for is they look for soft targets. And so if we've got high-value targets and then we advertise to the bad guys that these are also soft targets, that just makes these guys that much more vulnerable. And so we really needed to do something about it. So initially I approached the governor, and she was not as enthusiastic about doing anything. But then I had the opportunity to work with our Adjutant General, General Riddell, in the state. He recognized the problem and was able to work with me and a couple of other legislators to put together a bill that really tries to address this problem. And it addresses it in a way that I even think that there are some people who maybe have issues with the Second Amendment, or they're not as strong about the Second Amendment, but I don't even think they can really be offended by this bill.
Right.
Because essentially the bill does two things. One is we modify the force protection policy. I know that's kind of like military jargon, but it's basically the force protection policy that would either designate a facility as being a gun-free zone or not a gun-free zone. So we're going to modify their force protection policy, and we're not going to tell everybody what it says. So it's going to be kind of a Clint Eastwood moment. So the bad guys are going to come in and they're going to feel like, are you feeling lucky today?
Right.
Because they're not going to know, is this gun-free or is it not gun-free? Because quite frankly, that is the decision of the military. These guys are the ones who are responsible for that. But then we're going to go one step further, which is we've got men and women who are serving, who already have permits to carry concealed. They may, in fact, be carrying concealed on the facilities because that's the nature of concealed carry.
Right.
So it permits them to be able, if they're permitted to carry concealed in those facilities. And so the scope of this really will affect. We've got 2 recruiting centers, just like the recruiting centers that were attacked in Tennessee, and we've got 9 readiness centers in the state. And so these policies will, spread across all of those New Hampshire Guard facilities. And the reason, we were able to focus kind of at the Guard level is, first of all, I'm a state representative, so that's the scope that I control anyways.
Right.
But what happens is when we start to bring in a lot of the federal facilities or something like that, even though they're in our state, they bring with them a lot of federal rules, and so we can't really attack that problem. So really this is, focusing primarily just on the New Hampshire Guard facilities.
Excellent. And now, why do you think the governor or anyone else would push back on allowing the people who are actually trained, very well trained in firearms and firearm safety, to carry at their place of work, which, as you said, is a high-value target? And organizations like ISIS and other terrorists have already said, we attack military.
Right.
That's been put out there.
They're high-value targets.
Yeah, so why would anyone not want them to be armed?
Right. So, I don't know why somebody would not want them to be armed, honestly. I think it's a legitimate question, but we know in this country there are some people who either for lack of understanding or just lack of interest don't understand the Second Amendment and the rights that come along with that Second Amendment.
Right.
What's an interesting thing is you talk about some of the military personnel who are supposed to be trained in firearms not being trained in firearms. And one of the things that I did learn in this process, and I won't confess to being an expert on it, is that believe it or not, some of our military personnel don't use their firearms that often. They don't. Once they came in, they were trained initially, and then they haven't kept up with that training. So in fact, what we're going to do is we're going to work with General Riddell as well to try and get a range facility so that these guys can keep current in terms of their training. Because all the citizens have the expectation that if you're in the armed services, you know something about how to use arms.
Right.
And so we just need to make those two expectations kind of meet one another. But believe it or not, I think that there's a situation on the ground where you've got armed service personnel who are not that trained in their firearms. You may find that there's the guy who, belongs to the Londonderry Firearms, or range, fishing game down there.
Game, yeah.
And he's probably, maybe more trained in firearms use than some of our military personnel.
Wow. So now, have you heard from actual people that are working at these facilities about their opinions about this, what they think?
I have worked, nobody who's really able to go on the record because it's a military facility, these guys have protocols, and again, they're in the service, so they have to follow those protocols.
That's right.
So, you hear from them, and so you kind of know in the background what's going on, but you don't really end up with a lot of folks talking about that directly.
Right, and I remember last summer, I don't know if you recall, but because a lot of people in New Hampshire knew that these facilities were forcibly unarmed.
Right.
Actual people, residents of the state went and were outside protecting them with firearms.
Can I tell you, we still have that situation in New Hampshire. If you go to the facility, I think is it the Loudon facility? But this is, again, it's a federal facility. It's not a state facility.
Right.
It's being protected. And I have, and I apologize, I have spoken with folks who, went to those facilities and were protecting them. And basically, they saw their mission as one of, we'll be here and we'll protect these guys as long as they want us. And I think over time, what happened is that the military recruiters, they changed, they turned over, and so there were new guys who were coming in, and they said, we're not really comfortable having you guys outside, and so much of that service has waned at this point in time.
Right.
But it doesn't change the risk. I mean, look at what just happened in the last week in terms of the terror attacks in the United States.
Right.
So we know that this risk is real. And so we don't need to wait until there's a crisis before we do something. Let's intervene now before the crisis happens and make these facilities, more secure and safe for the men and women who serve.
Well, and then you had Fort Hood several years ago.
Correct. We had the Fort Hood thing as well.
And of course, the terrorist in that case, I refuse to name his name, broke the law and brought a firearm onto the base in a place he wasn't supposed to bring it.
Right.
So you have people that are, again, sitting ducks in a gun-free zone, high-value targets, unarmed, because they're not going to break the law. They're, obviously it could affect their career too.
Exactly, it could affect their career, and again, these are law-abiding citizens.
Right.
And what we know is that law-abiding citizens follow the law. It's the guys who want to break the law that don't follow the law, which is kind of the the specious aspect of the whole argument. In terms of more gun control in the state. Because we don't necessarily, or even in the country, because again, law-abiding citizens are going to follow those laws, but people who are not going to follow the law are not going to, are going to continue to break the law, and they're going to do bad things.
Right. So now, what's the next step for your bill?
So the next step for the bill is it's going to get assigned to a committee. And then we'll go through the hearing process, and I will be bringing in a number of different folks to testify on behalf of that bill, including retired personnel who are in a position to be able to, comment on these types of things.
Great.
And I hope that General Riddell will even, I've asked him to come in and testify on behalf of that bill. I'm not sure whether he'll be able to do that or not. Probably because he works for the governor.
Right.
And so he is that, he'll testify to the extent that he's permitted to do such a thing or to do that. But I hope that we'll get folks in there testifying on behalf of it. And I think that it's a fairly straightforward bill to pass. I would be really surprised if we're not able to get something like that passed. And so I would hope that, by the time we get to May, that our men and women who serve in the New Hampshire Guard are safer.
Great. Thank you so much, Representative.
Thank you. I appreciate it.